My name is Julia Merritt. I'm 34 years old and serve as Deputy Assistant Director for Counterintelligence. I live in a high-rise in Manhattan with a view no one in my family has ever seen. I own 2 suits tailored in London, 1 pair of running shoes older than most marriages in my family, and I keep a second phone that never rings unless the stakes are real. Most people think I'm single, quiet, unremarkable. That's how I prefer it. It was late September when it happened. My brother's wedding was held on a sprawling private estate in Bedford Hills, the kind of place where white peacocks wander the lawn and no one parks their own car. The invitation arrived 4 months earlier, embossed and oversized. I RSVP'd alone. No plus one. No explanations. The estate was arranged like a magazine spread. Perfection, curated down to the blush on the hydrangeas. I arrived on time, walked past strangers who shared my DNA, and was directed to a table far from the head. The tablecloth had a faint stain, possibly wine, maybe lipstick. No one made eye contact. By the second course, the mood had lifted. Toasts began. Benjamin looked pleased in his made-to-measure tux, standing beside a woman who matched the wallpaper behind her. My father delivered his speech from a polished podium near the reflecting pool. It was filled with praise, legacy, lineage, the usual mythology. I took small bites, drank only water, and waited. Afterward, I stepped away from the crowd toward the edge of the stone path circling the pond. I wasn't trying to escape, only to breathe. He followed. I heard his shoes before his voice. I didn't turn. The push wasn't violent, just deliberate, calculated. I hit the water hard enough to bruise. There was a pause, long enough to matter. Then came the laughter. Polite, uncertain at first, then clearer. Someone clapped. Someone else took a photo. No one moved to help. The koi scattered as I surfaced. The hem of my dress tangled at my knees, and my heels scraped the algae-slick rocks. I stood up, alone, soaked, and silent. I saw my father's back retreating toward the main tent. My mother's eyes never left her wineglass. My brother had already turned away. I brushed the hair from my face and walked out of the pond with nothing left to lose. I learned early that the best way to be underestimated was to say very little and let people fill in the blanks for themselves. My family was excellent at that. They constructed an entire version of me, fragile, overly serious, emotionally stunted, and maintained it like a museum exhibit. When I stopped attending Thanksgiving, they said it was because I couldn't stand to be around people more successful than me. When I missed Benjamin's first wedding, they told themselves I was ashamed. No one ever considered that maybe I had somewhere more important to be. Or someone. The truth is, I started withdrawing when I realized silence gave me more control than any argument ever could. I kept my personal life sealed so tightly that even my neighbors didn't know who I was married to. I filed the paperwork under a different name. The ceremony was held in a courthouse 2 states away. We had 2 witnesses, one from my side, one from his, and a dinner afterward that cost less than my brother's rehearsal boutonnieres. It wasn't secrecy born from shame. It was self-preservation. His name is Christopher. I rarely say it out loud in public spaces. When we met, he didn't know what I did, and I didn't know who he was. It took 3 weeks before we exchanged real credentials. He ran a private cybersecurity firm with contracts buried beneath multiple levels of clearance. I worked internal threats, state-backed actors, domestic penetrations. We spoke the same language, though neither of us said much. We didn't have to. The first year of our marriage was quiet by design. Separate residences, alternating weekends. He traveled internationally. I worked nights. We left no digital footprint, not because we were paranoid, but because we were practiced. At work, I never mentioned a spouse. At home, there was no visible trace of him unless you knew exactly what to look for. A coded message on the fridge. A second toothbrush in a drawer never left open. We weren't hiding from the world. We were just choosing not to perform for it. The real shift began when I was promoted. A quiet internal ceremony. A new badge, a new office with soundproof walls, a new line I couldn't cross between what I knew and what I could share. My name was floated in internal briefings. My decisions began shaping policy. And yet, at the next family gathering I reluctantly attended, my father introduced me as working in admin for the feds. I let it pass. He didn't deserve correction. 3 months ago, when the invitation to Benjamin's wedding arrived, I almost threw it out. I kept it, only because of the note my mother scrawled in the margin. "We hope you'll find time for family this time." As if absence had been the betrayal, not everything that came before it. I stared at that line longer than I should have. Then I marked the date in my calendar and filed it under non-essential commitments. I didn't mention it to Christopher at first. He was finalizing a joint agreement with a defense contractor and had 3 trips lined up back to back. When I finally brought it up, I kept my voice flat. Just a date, just a location. I didn't say who would be there or how they'd treat me. I didn't have to. He offered to come, to reschedule, to send a driver. I said no. It was better this way. What I didn't tell him, and what I didn't quite admit to myself, was that I wanted to see how far they'd go this time. There's a strange calculus in being treated like a failure long enough. Eventually, you become curious about the point of no return. I needed to know if they'd crossed it, or if I had. The day before the wedding, I went through my usual prep ritual. Documents locked, alerts transferred, emergency codes updated, travel routes confirmed. I packed 2 dresses, one for the event, one for contingency. I checked and rechecked my device clearance protocols. Then I told my assistant I'd be out of reach for 24 hours. It was a lie. I never go fully offline. Not anymore. The drive to Bedford Hills was unremarkable. The weather was cooperative. The trees just beginning to turn. I played music the entire way, classical, unfamiliar. I arrived 20 minutes early and parked down the hill from the estate. No one noticed me walking in. That part was expected. The seating arrangement had already told me everything I needed to know. My name was misprinted on the place card. Julia Marette. No title. No affiliation. Just a minor typo, they'd say. But I knew better. I'd been erased in stages over the years, so subtly I sometimes wondered if I imagined it. This time, I had proof. The bride's sister gave a speech I barely heard. The wine was excellent. The food was predictable. By the time dessert was served, my napkin was damp from condensation, and I'd counted 3 separate guests who asked if I was still between jobs. I nodded, smiled, and gave them nothing. The plan wasn't complicated. It never had been. I didn't need to make a scene. I didn't need to prove anything. I just needed to endure, to absorb every slight, every omission, every whispered remark, because their confidence was the key. The deeper they believed their own version of me, the cleaner the reversal would be. What they didn't know, my backup dress wasn't for fashion. It was for extraction. The car in the parking lot had a second driver waiting. My location had been pinned since I arrived. Every table had been scanned before guests were seated. Security was never about theatrics. It was about position. And the moment I stood dripping from that pond, I knew the window had opened. Their cruelty had crested. Their certainty had peaked. The air shifted. A few guests looked uncomfortable, but most returned to their conversations, eager to pretend nothing had happened. That was the final data point I needed. When I reached the powder room and locked the door behind me, I peeled off the ruined dress and stood in silence for a minute. No shaking, no tears, just stillness. The woman in the mirror wasn't the girl they'd built stories around. She didn't flinch. She didn't vanish. She calculated. 10 minutes later, I emerged in black. Simple, structured, dry. I retrieved my phone from the clutch I'd hidden under the seat. 1 text sent, 1 name, 1 time. No explanation, no emotion, just confirmation. The perimeter was already in place. The next move wasn't mine. The quietest moments often follow the loudest humiliations. I had always found that to be true. The powder room was tiled in soft gray marble with lighting calibrated for comfort. My replacement dress hung neatly in the garment bag I had packed 2 nights earlier. It slid on without resistance. Black, sleeveless, deliberately unmemorable. I fixed my hair into a low knot, pulled out a compact from my clutch, and redrew my eyeliner with the same care I used to sign federal affidavits. The air was cooler outside, or maybe it just felt that way now. I moved slowly, deliberately, as if I hadn't just been submerged in a pond under the eyes of my family, as if nothing at all had happened. The path was dry, the music resumed, and servers floated by with champagne flutes like swans. Conversations buzzed around centerpieces I no longer registered. The advantage of a spectacle is how quickly it consumes attention, then discards it. People don't want to linger in discomfort. They prefer restoration, the illusion that everything is still on script. And I gave them exactly that. I smiled when spoken to. I nodded at jokes I didn't hear. I stood just close enough to groups to be seen, but not spoken to. I made no effort to return to my original table. It was still there, of course, an exile disguised as hospitality. But I positioned myself instead along the central walkway near the entrance. I could see the dance floor from there, the cake, the band, my mother performing her idea of maternal grace. My father, stiff-backed, sipping bourbon he always claimed was for taste. Benjamin posed for photos again, one hand on his wife's hip, the other holding a glass he never actually drank from. No one came to check on me. I didn't expect them to. What would they say? They'd already built their justification before I dried off. Maybe I had slipped. Maybe I was dramatic. Maybe I needed attention. They were rehearsing the revised narrative even now, ready to deliver it at tennis clubs and charity luncheons. The truth was never required. I watched them from a short distance, a curated portrait of belonging, every gesture carefully arranged, every laugh timed. I knew these patterns. I used to try to decode them, to adapt myself to fit into the logic. Now I simply observed. The detachment was not numbness. It was control. My phone vibrated once in my hand. The name that appeared meant the perimeter had shifted. There was movement, subtle, precise, expected. I did not respond. I did not need to. The arrangements were already alive without my touch. I adjusted the hem of my dress. It fell just past the knee, neutral enough to register as forgettable in photographs. The neckline revealed nothing. My shoes? Practical. I had removed the earrings, too reflective under chandelier lighting, and kept only the bracelet, simple, metal, and encoded. Every detail was deliberate. From across the tent, I noticed my mother glance in my direction. Her gaze was brief, uninterested. She returned to her conversation without pause. Someone nearby handed her another glass. She accepted it with the practiced grace of someone who had never reached for anything that wasn't offered first. A server approached me, offering something on a tray. I declined with a slight motion of my hand. The server moved on. No eye contact was exchanged. The music changed. Slower now. Guests began to move toward the dance floor again. The usual groupings formed. Aunts, couples, new in-laws testing out their newfound bonds. Laughter returned, cautious but steady. I remained still. Time passed differently in those minutes. Elastic, stretched thin between breaths. I watched as my brother gave a toast I couldn't hear. I watched my father clap him on the back with a force too performative to be affection. I watched my mother press her napkin to her lips between sips, a habit she'd developed to keep lipstick intact. A child ran past me, unattended, dragging a streamer from one hand. It caught briefly on my ankle before trailing off toward the hedges. I didn't move. The child never looked back. The edge of the tent lifted slightly with the breeze. Beyond it, the parking area sat in shadow. From where I stood, I could see nothing. But I knew the timing. I'd memorized it. A group of older guests passed behind me, murmuring softly about the bride's dress. I let their voices drift past without registering content. The champagne flutes clinked again. More laughter. A violinist adjusted his bow. Still, I waited. The silence beneath the noise was what I listened to. Not the music, but the breath between notes. Not the conversation, but the rhythm of glance and reply. I counted each. Somewhere in the far corner, a photographer adjusted his lens. His flash went off once, twice, 3 times. Each click recorded not just the image, but the narrative, the one they'd tell tomorrow. But not all narratives remain in control. I shifted my stance, placed both hands at my sides, and exhaled once through the nose. My posture was open, but not inviting. Calm, but not passive. A signal that most people wouldn't recognize. But 1 or 2 might. I did not look at my watch. I did not need to. Timing, in my experience, was rarely about clocks. It was about tension, and the tension now was full, not visible, not discussed, but present. The wind changed, only slightly, enough to lift the edge of one tablecloth, enough to stir one branch against another, enough to signal that the sequence had moved forward by one invisible step. I turned slightly, adjusting my angle to face the entrance. My face remained composed. The line of my shoulders was even, my breathing controlled. A second vibration, this one shorter, confirmed. I kept my hand still, let the bracelet touch skin. The lights dimmed for the evening program. A man near the stage tapped a microphone. Feedback whined and settled. The air held, the wait ended, the lights over the tent dimmed to signal a transition. A shift from speeches to spectacle, from the curated politeness of dinner to the performative intimacy of celebration. I remained where I was, still and patient, surrounded by people who no longer registered me as anything more than a shadow in the background. The music softened. The chatter became subdued. A hush began to build, faint at first, then spreading like a ripple pulled outward by an unseen force. Movement at the perimeter changed everything. Two figures appeared at the edge of the crowd, their attire indistinguishable from any well-dressed guest, but their presence immediately reframed the atmosphere. They didn't rush. They didn't pause. They simply advanced with precision, each step measured, each glance calculated. The crowd parted, not with fear, but with the kind of instinctive deference that no amount of social capital could command. People began turning their heads. Some whispered. A few tried to smile as if the situation were still under control. When the third figure entered, taller, unhurried, composed in a way that didn't invite curiosity but demanded awareness, something shifted in the air. Conversations died mid-sentence. A server froze mid-pour. The band fell silent without cue. Attention gathered and held, as though the room had suddenly remembered a forgotten guest. I didn't move to meet him. There was no need. He walked directly toward me, bypassing everyone else with a quiet authority that required no introduction. Recognition began to dawn in fragments. A woman near the cake gasped. A man by the bar fumbled for his phone, likely to verify what he suspected but couldn't quite believe. He reached me without ceremony, his presence answering questions no one had dared to ask. There were no gestures, no announcements. He stood beside me, the silence thick around us, the contrast stark against everything that had preceded it. His arrival didn't demand attention. It redefined it. That was when the panic began to take shape. My mother's face altered first. Her smile stiffened, eyes darting between me and the man who now stood beside me with practiced ease. She stepped forward, a fraction too late, her composure a half-second behind her instincts. My father's voice cut across the space next, louder than necessary, attempting to reassert control through sheer volume. His words tried to form a question, then a command, then something in between, but the weight of the moment reduced it to noise. Guests backed away slightly, not out of fear, but uncertainty. The dynamics had changed, and no one had received the memo. Faces that had carried polite amusement now showed something closer to concern, or calculation. A few instinctively straightened their posture, adjusting jackets, smoothing dresses. The instinct to perform returned, though this time it was no longer clear who the audience was. My brother appeared next, drawn by the shift in gravity. He stepped in from the side, confusion evident in the way he scanned the scene. The bride lingered behind him, her steps hesitant, her expression unreadable beneath expertly applied makeup. They had expected a highlight. They now stood inside something they hadn't rehearsed for. The man beside me didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence answered a question no one had thought to ask, and now couldn't ignore. My silence became a mirror. Every unspoken insult, every dismissal, every absence they had explained away in their own terms now returned to them unfiltered. A small cluster of guests near the center began murmuring, phones already in hand. Recognition spread digitally now, faster than words. A name attached to a face. A face attached to a title. A title connected to everything that had been assumed about me, now slowly coming undone in real time. My father took another step forward. His hands moved with the performative authority of someone accustomed to commanding rooms. His mouth opened again, but whatever statement he had prepared faltered under the gaze of the man beside me. Not because of volume or even threat, but because nothing he could say now would matter more than what had already arrived. Security tightened subtly. Additional figures appeared near the exits, their presence silent but deliberate. None of them addressed anyone. They didn't need to. They were there for assurance, not escalation. And that assurance did not belong to my family. At that moment, a new pair of arrivals entered the reception. Their suits were unbranded. Their movements, unhurried, they approached with quiet focus, their pace neither rushed nor slow. One of them stopped just short of our position, handed over a small device, and spoke a sentence too low for anyone else to hear. I nodded. The device displayed what I needed. No more, no less. A single confirmation, the kind that required no verbal response. I returned it without comment. The man beside me took it and slipped it into the interior pocket of his jacket, his attention still steady, still composed. My mother attempted to recover. Her voice rose slightly above the ambient hum, trying to recast the moment into something digestible. A misunderstanding, perhaps. An unexpected guest. She gestured toward the man beside me, then toward me, her hands fluttering as if shaping air into explanation. It failed. A nearby guest asked a question that she couldn't answer. Another asked if I had always been married. Someone else mentioned a recent article, a name, a profile. Connections formed rapidly, awkwardly, irreversibly. My name, once used to fill a table without disrupting the narrative, now reordered the entire narrative itself. The band never resumed playing. The photographer shifted focus, lens angling sharply toward me. Flashes followed, not candid anymore, but documentary. Evidence of presence, proof of reversal. I stayed still. The more they moved around me, the less I needed to speak. Their reactions wrote the story. My silence became the headline. Somewhere near the catering tent, a tray dropped. Glass shattered. No one noticed. My brother approached, finally, his pace uncertain. His greetings stalled mid-breath. His eyes moved between us, calculation replacing familiarity. Behind him, the bride lowered her veil slightly, as though it could obscure what had already become public record. Another guest asked if the rumors were true. Another whispered that the man beside me had once briefed senior officials behind closed doors. Someone else said I looked different. That was the closest anyone came to telling the truth. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, just full. I remained composed. I had not raised my voice. I had not explained. I had not defended myself. I didn't have to. Everything else was already doing it for me. The invitation arrived on thick ivory cardstock, sealed with the understated emblem of a university I hadn't walked through in over a decade. It had been forwarded through a secure channel, routed carefully before it landed on my desk among operational memos and encrypted briefings. There was nothing urgent about it, nothing that required clearance or protocol. Just a name. Mine, listed in a program alongside alumni who had become diplomats, CEOs, judges. They wanted me to speak. The event was scheduled for the fall during homecoming weekend, a leadership symposium on resilience and public service. The kind of gathering where people wore their titles like armor and their stories like evidence. I stared at the invitation longer than I should have. I remembered the last time I had walked across that campus lawn, diploma in hand, uncertain whether anyone in my family would show up. They hadn't. This time, there was no need to ask. The auditorium was smaller than I expected, paneled in old wood, the kind that absorbed sound and history alike. I stood behind the curtain while the moderator read a list of credentials I rarely heard said aloud. It was clinical, precise, and somehow impersonal. My name sounded like someone else's until the audience grew quiet. I stepped onto the stage without notes. No projection, no performance. Just a slow, deliberate walk to the podium. I scanned the room and saw faces, some curious, some skeptical, a few expectant. I didn't try to win them. I didn't need to. The story had already done its work. All that remained was presence. I didn't start with the wedding. I didn't mention the pond, the silence, the cameras. I spoke of systems, of institutions that reward the visible and punish the quiet, of spaces where being overlooked becomes a survival skill. I told them about years of showing up, not being seen, of choosing not to correct the record until it mattered, of knowing exactly when silence becomes leverage. I watched as the room shifted, not dramatically, but noticeably. People leaned forward. Eyes narrowed, not in doubt, but attention. One woman in the front row took notes with a kind of urgency I recognized. Not for publication, but for herself. Afterward, I stayed. Not out of obligation, but interest. People approached in quiet clusters. Some asked about career paths, others about risk. A few just stood close without speaking, as if proximity was permission. One man, older than most, said he remembered me from a debate competition, said I had been sharp even then. I didn't correct him. I had never competed in debates, but I thanked him anyway. Back in the hotel that evening, I sat with a glass of water and reread the handwritten notes left at the podium. Most were short, grateful, thoughtful. One stood out. It was from a young woman who had watched the reception video online after it leaked, unsure if it was real. She wrote that seeing someone like me hold her ground without shouting made her reconsider how she carried herself. She didn't sign her name. She didn't need to. I folded the note and slipped it into the back of my journal. In the months that followed, things quieted in the way meaningful change often does. Not with celebration, but with adjustment. My father stopped calling. My mother sent a card at Christmas. My brother emailed once, unsigned, forwarding a link to an op-ed I had contributed to anonymously. My response was brief, formal. I felt no anger, only distance. Christopher and I settled back into rhythm. Mornings were steady, nights efficient. Occasionally, we talked about what came next, not in terms of ambition, but intention. The kind of work that didn't need to be credited to matter. The kind of impact that came from knowing who you were, even when no one else did. On the anniversary of the wedding, I stood by the window of our apartment again. The city below pulsed as it always had, indifferent and beautiful. A new report sat open on my screen, half-edited, waiting for approval. Behind me, the news played without sound, scrolling updates about things that would matter for a moment, then fade. I thought of the pond, the silence, the laughter. I thought of what it meant to stand still while the room changed around you, of what it took to remain quiet until the moment demanded you be loud, not with words, but with presence. Recognition, I had learned, is rarely immediate. Justice, even less so. But truth, when held long enough, begins to shape the space it occupies. Not to punish, but to balance. Not to shout, but to settle. And sometimes that's all the closure you need. The invitation arrived on thick ivory cardstock, sealed with the understated emblem of a university I hadn't walked through in over a decade. It had been forwarded through a secure channel, routed carefully before it landed on my desk among operational memos and encrypted briefings. There was nothing urgent about it, nothing that required clearance or protocol. Just a name, mine, listed in a program alongside alumni who had become diplomats, CEOs, judges. They wanted me to speak. The event was scheduled for the fall, during homecoming weekend, a leadership symposium on resilience and public service. The kind of gathering where people wore their titles like armor and their stories like evidence. I stared at the invitation longer than I should have. I remembered the last time I had walked across that campus lawn, diploma in hand, uncertain whether anyone in my family would show up. They hadn't. This time, there was no need to ask. The auditorium was smaller than I expected, paneled in old wood, the kind that absorbed sound and history alike. I stood behind the curtain while the moderator read a list of credentials I rarely heard said aloud. It was clinical, precise, and somehow impersonal. My name sounded like someone else's until the audience grew quiet. I stepped onto the stage without notes. No projection, no performance, just a slow, deliberate walk to the podium. I scanned the room and saw faces, some curious, some skeptical, a few expectant. I didn't try to win them. I didn't need to. The story had already done its work. All that remained was presence. I didn't start with the wedding. I didn't mention the pond, the silence, the cameras. I spoke of systems, of institutions that reward the visible and punish the quiet, of spaces where being overlooked becomes a survival skill. I told them about years of showing up, not being seen, of choosing not to correct the record until it mattered, of knowing exactly when silence becomes leverage. I watched as the room shifted, not dramatically but noticeably. People leaned forward, eyes narrowed, not in doubt, but attention. One woman in the front row took notes with a kind of urgency I recognized, not for publication, but for herself. Afterward, I stayed, not out of obligation, but interest. People approached in quiet clusters. Some asked about career paths, others about risk. A few just stood close without speaking, as if proximity was permission. One man, older than most, said he remembered me from a debate competition, said I had been sharp even then. I didn't correct him. I had never competed in debates. But I thanked him anyway. Back in the hotel that evening, I sat with a glass of water and reread the handwritten notes left at the podium. Most were short, grateful, thoughtful. One stood out. It was from a young woman who had watched the reception video online after it leaked, unsure if it was real. She wrote that seeing someone like me hold her ground without shouting made her reconsider how she carried herself. She didn't sign her name. She didn't need to. I folded the note and slipped it into the back of my journal. In the months that followed, things quieted in the way meaningful change often does. Not with celebration, but with adjustment. My father stopped calling. My mother sent a card at Christmas. My brother emailed once, unsigned, forwarding a link to an op-ed I had contributed to anonymously. My response was brief, formal. I felt no anger, only distance. Christopher and I settled back into rhythm. Mornings were steady, nights efficient. Occasionally, we talked about what came next, not in terms of ambition, but intention. The kind of work that didn't need to be credited to matter. The kind of impact that came from knowing who you were, even when no one else did. On the anniversary of the wedding, I stood by the window of our apartment again. The city below pulsed as it always had, indifferent and beautiful. A new report sat open on my screen, half-edited, waiting for approval. Behind me, the news played without sound, scrolling updates about things that would matter for a moment, then fade. I thought of the pond, the silence, the laughter. I thought of what it meant to stand still while the room changed around you, of what it took to remain quiet until the moment demanded you be loud, not with words, but with presence. Recognition, I had learned, is rarely immediate. Justice, even less so. But truth, when held long enough, begins to shape the space it occupies. Not to punish, but to balance. Not to shout, but to settle. And sometimes that's all the closure you need. Sometimes it isn't the loudest voice that shifts the room. It's the one that waits, watches, and chooses the right moment to be heard. Not for applause, but for truth. For years, I believed that being overlooked meant being unworthy. I tried to disappear quietly, to take up less space, to avoid disturbing the narrative others wrote for me. But silence, when chosen with intention, is not weakness. It's power held in reserve. In the end, I didn't fight for recognition. I simply stood in it. What changed wasn't the world overnight, but the way I stood inside it. I stopped trying to be seen by those who had no interest in looking, and instead honored the parts of myself that knew my worth before anyone else did. Maybe you've been there too, invisible in rooms you helped build, dismissed in conversations you were qualified to lead. Maybe you've stayed silent, not because you lacked the words, but because you knew no one was ready to listen. And maybe the time is coming when you'll no longer need to explain. The truth has a way of finding its shape, not through spectacle, but through steadiness. So here's a question I've been carrying. What would it look like if your worth no longer depended on who noticed you, but on how deeply you know yourself? I'd like to believe that when we stop shrinking to fit the space we're given, we begin creating space for others to stand taller too.